Welcome back to the main plenary room again. I hope you all enjoyed the discussion in the parallel sessions. And we're now moving to our plenary, which has a development focus. This morning, it was said that the OECD Reinforcing Democracy Initiative is mainly focused on the current challenges to long-established OECD democracies. Nevertheless, and we'll hear that, I'm sure, developing and transition economies are facing the same challenges that compound to their more long-term challenges of building solid institutions. The Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, served by the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, has long-standing work in the area to frame development cooperation to support democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, including freedom of expression and peaceful assembly and association. So we're now going to discuss these issues, and I would like to invite the moderator, Frédéric Matisse, Head of Global Partnership and Policies at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, and the panelists in this plenary session to move on stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Sorry for cutting your break. My name is Frédéric Matisse. I'm the Head of Global Partnerships and Policies in the Development Cooperation Directorate. And I'm very happy to moderate this panel today, which has the title, Current Geopolitical Challenges, Consequences for Development Assistance. I think it's already been said multiple times today that our world is a troubled place. We have multiple crises upon us, the largest number of fragile states according to the States of Fragility 2022 report. And we've spoken a lot about other countries today, but also mentioning that also in OECD countries we're actually seeing an increased fragility, and this is the report, a little bit of publicity for my department. Climate crisis is no longer something of the future, it's right here. We have an increasing number of countries classified as autocratic. Irrespective of which index you're using, you'll see that the number of people living under autocratic regimes is growing. There's a backlash against women, growing populism, mis- and disinformation, and increasing inequalities between and within countries, combined with geopolitical challenges, Russia's war in Ukraine, Syrian and Ethiopian civil wars, prolonged instability in Sudan, Somalia, other countries, and I could probably still continue a long list. The ambition of today is to look at those geopolitical challenges with a focus on the role of official development assistance, development cooperation, and in particular in relation to reinforcing democracy. So I'm very much looking forward to have some frank thoughts from our panelists, and I'm very happy to introduce our panelists, and I'll start immediately to my left, Mampela Rampele, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome since October 2018, also serves as the chair of the Desmond Tutu Trust Fund. She has a celebrated career as an activist, medical doctor, academic, businesswoman, author, political thinker, was also managing director for the World Bank, and much more. To her left is Thomas Grimminger, who is the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Before that, he served as the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And before that, a long career as ambassador and several functions in the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. And to my extreme left is Susanna Moorhead, who is the chair of the Development Assistance Committee, which brings together, since yesterday, 31 member states, and it's a unique international forum to promote development cooperation and other relevant policies contributing to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And Susanna, before that, had a long career as British ambassador, was also the UK's executive director on the board of the World Bank, and worked for DFID, Save the Children, and the Institute of Development Studies. So we have quite an interesting perspective. If I would simplify it, I would say there's a bilateral focus, there's a multilateral focus, there's a partner country, civil society, foundation, so we have a little bit of everything. Just to kick off the discussion, Now, I'll just go down the line. So I mentioned a lot of challenges. How do you see this evolving where you are sitting? And if you can focus on reinforcing democracy, do you see anything positive on the horizon? What will be the next frontiers for the next decade?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Geopolitics in our world today, which is a troubled world, reflects legacies that we have not been willing to address. And the legacy of colonial conquest, which set the framework for state capture. I come from a country which has wasted nearly 30 years of its post-apartheid period because all they did was to step into the shoes of those who used to run government. But is there hope? Absolutely. I am delighted to see young South Africans today stepping up and raising their hands, not only in terms of civic activism, which is alive and well, and that's what actually defeated apartheid. It wasn't the ANC from Lusaka with an armed struggle that defeated apartheid. It was ordinary people in all walks of life. But what remains to be done is to heal the nations, not just my country, but the whole continent of Africa suffers still from the mentality of looking at public service as an elite opportunity to use state resources for personal interest. So that mindset shift is also happening, and that is also very positive. But it requires support from the rest of the world because colonial conquest made Europe very rich and extracted resources from the African continent, from Asia and other parts. And so if we want to see global equity for a healthy planet, we need to be thinking beyond just talking about the need for good governance, but investing in good governance as an important input into shaping the kind of future of a liberated people where we as human beings start behaving like the single human family that we are. Governance of the commons requires the building of trust, and that trust building comes from human to human conversations, such as has been described by some of the panelists earlier on. So I'm very positive that the future is available to all of us to shape, but we cannot do it with the imagery of the G7, the G20, and much of public institutions dominated by men in black suits and very little visibility of women and young people in public office. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy I'm wearing my navy blue suit today. Thomas, do you feel the same optimism?
Well, I wish I would. Let me perhaps point to a couple of geopolitical challenges that will affect the political environment in which ODA will operate, both in political environments of donor countries, but also in recipient countries. And one is clearly the state of Russia's war against Ukraine. And since we don't have a crystal ball, I think we'll have to reflect in scenarios. And I think it will depend, will we still be facing the continuation of a high-intensity war? Now, applying a medium-term perspective, I hope not. Will we have transited to something that looks more than a low-intensity conflict with or with a weak ceasefire, without a ceasefire, a bit similar to what we've seen since 2014? Will we witness escalations, conventionally, non-conventionally, in cyberspace, by targeting civilian infrastructures to a totally different extent? Or will we have an end of the war? If we have an end of the war, will it be a negotiated end of the war, perceived to be fair by the key stakeholders, including, of course, by Ukraine itself, or will it be a type of Versailles end of the war? And this all, I think, will affect quite fundamentally the geopolitical environment in which we will operate. Needless to say, I could also, of course, expand on another important geopolitical dimension, and that is the question on how the strategic rivalry will be played out between the United States and China. Will this be a relatively smartly managed competition, or will it turn into an increasingly hostile confrontation? Now, I could, at a later stage, get back to some of the repercussions of the war on the environment in more on the ODA environment in more specific terms, but I'll stop here.
Thank you. Susanna, what's your reflection on this optimism, or rather pessimism?
Look, I think you have to be an optimist in this world, and particularly at the moment. And if we look back at recent history, what you see is that necessity is the mother of invention. I think if you look at the storm clouds that have been gathering now for at least a decade across the global economy and elsewhere, the age of complacency is over. I mean, the age when I think we overpromised what we could do for the global south, when we thought that we were making linear progress on women's rights, when we thought that democracies were not really under threat, that again we were moving forward. What we're seeing is real reversals. We're seeing people being thrown back into poverty. We're seeing today, in 2022, people starving to death in a number of countries, and that is a massive collective failure of humanity. I think we could spend time thinking about whose fault it is. I'm sure that would make for a very lively debate. But paradoxically, I think there is probably a far greater agreement on the diagnosis of what the problems are, but not much on what we do about it. And I do agree that the global architecture needs reforming. I mean, it was designed for a different era. It was designed, in the midst of the Second World War, and although the multilateral system needs reform, I think we need to somehow harness the impetus for reform that has come out of, say, what's happening in Ukraine or elsewhere. I am optimistic too about young people and the seriousness with which they take the climate threat. I think our generation actually will be judged extremely harshly by our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and I think collectively we need to take the intergenerational bargain far more seriously than we do at the moment. I'm optimistic about science. The problem with COVID was not the scientists. They developed the vaccine. The problem was the politicians who couldn't get it to all the places where it needed to go. But there is huge potential to harness science, to leapfrog poverty, to think about an entirely renewable grid that can then not only make sure that people, say, in the Sahel have the access to electricity they deserve, but they can produce a surplus and sell it back to Europe. That's sustainable development. And the cost of renewables is tumbling if we get the investment in the right places. I am optimistic about the power of women, but I'm worried that our power is curtailed when we appear to be too powerful. And also, and this may sound odd, but there are enough resources, there's enough financial resources in the world to reduce poverty, to meet many of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's a distributional question and a question of political will. So it takes us back to, I think, where we started, that we need to be ambitious for reforming the global architecture, and we need, as democracies, to put pressure on our leaders to invest in the global commons and internationally. And that is very, very difficult at this particular juncture.
Thank you. I think I'm going to follow your arguments. Let's not look at who's to blame, but let's see what we can do about this. Ampela, you already alluded to the fact that you are critical about development assistance, and you actually wrote in an article for this forum, and if I can quote you, "Development assistance is a cruel trick played by wealthy countries on their former colonies from which they extracted resources to build their wealth, thus impoverishing them. To imagine that providing conditional aid to such countries in the form of 1% of GDP of wealthy countries is adding insult to injury." So these are quite strong, it's quite a strong language that's out there in the public. So what's the alternative? How do you reform it? How do you, what's your proposals?
First of all, if you want to put right what went wrong, you acknowledge what went wrong. Imagine if someone comes to take over your house and then they mess it up, and of course you have to, after a couple of decades, they vacate the house. And then they'd say to you, they'll send you $10,000 every month. Is that fair? Whereas, I think what we really need to do is to acknowledge that the multiple generations of people in most of the world were deprived of resources that could have put them in a very different space. But you can't undo history. We learn from history. So how do we put right what went wrong? I believe acknowledgement will help in decolonizing the minds of governments in my part of the world. Because what's happened in South Africa is that the incoming government just continued with the same kind of elite approach to governance. So my proposal is also triggered by what is happening on the planetary emergencies, particularly climate change. That there's acceptance now that for us as a planetary community, as a human family, we cannot but agree to pooling our resources. And we're not talking millions, we're talking billions, to help those countries that are going to be severely and are being severely disadvantaged and endangered by climate change. The same applies to the opportunity costs that have been visited upon the most of the world populations. We need to think not in terms of we blame you, therefore you must do X, but in terms of if we want to build global equity for a healthy planet, not the SDGs. I really think you talked about, Susan, about we need to raise our ambitions. The SDGs is the lowest common ambition that you could set. None of us sitting in this room would regard living on $4 a day as adequate. So there is a built-in into the kind of SDG speak that there are people who are, for whom $4 a day is good enough. So I think we need to go back to who we really are. Remember that we are one human family. You wouldn't want your family to be living on $4 a day. And I don't believe we can do it tomorrow, but if we have the commitment, we can all work towards it. The good news is that there are self-organizing communities all over the world, including in my own country. And I was very pleased to see that Prime Minister Trudeau is going to indigenous communities to help Canada to use indigenous science to look after their forests. Can we do the same across the spectrum? Because there is a lot of wisdom, there is a lot of goodwill, and there is a lot of talent amongst people who have been left behind by the extractive, financialized, global economic system that we have right now. We need to also be tackling reframing of economics and rethinking of finance away from this extractive process that is impoverishing millions and enriching very few people. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe I'll go directly to Susanna for the next question, or linking to this. So it's about rethinking, and it's also about rethinking development assistance, which you also put in your editorial to the states of fragility. It's about fresh thinking and new approaches that are urgently required because the complexity and the scale of crises are too complex. So hearing what Monpela has said on this, how do you see this working? Where could ODA be catalytic to actually do that bigger thinking that Monpela is asking for?
I mean, ODA, official development assistance, is imperfect. We know that, but it is dynamic as well. I mean, I think if you look at ODA, even 20 years ago, it was a very different kind of instrument from what it is today. I mean, the development effectiveness principles that were introduced, which were very much based on partnership, and for which there's a key summit in Geneva next month, when the world will come together to see how we can use every euro of this fantastically scarce resource as well as possible. But it is a shrinking amount of the resource flows. But nevertheless, the demand for it is rising exponentially. It's pretty much flat. We don't yet have the data for last year, but it's not going to go up very much. But there are more and more and more demands on it. I mentioned famine. I mean, if you have a flat ODA climate, the more you spend on humanitarian relief, the less you spend on development. There are some countries who have alternative sources of finance, but others for whom this highly concessional resource is invaluable. Now look, I wish that all DAC members, including Lithuania, who's our newest, who joined yesterday, gave at least 0.7% of GNI as ODA, but I'm a realist. That's not going to happen at the moment. I also wish that the rich countries of the world would live up to their commitment of at least 100 billion a year on climate. But we are where we are, and my biggest concern is that, rather like a very fine piece of fabric, if you pull ODA in multiple directions, it will just tear, and there will be nothing left. So one of the things we do in the Development Effectiveness Committee, the Development Assistance Committee, is to try and set some rules, some standards, some norms about how partner countries can choose how to use their ODA. Now, some of that is quite controversial. We, for example, spend a lot of time providing guidance on gender equality, on empowering and investing in civil society, on building up strong institutions to promote citizen voice, democratic transitions, which is not always in the interests of all political elites. But we do what we can with this resource, but we also say increasingly regularly that ODA cannot do it all, and at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the private sector to invest far more, to generate jobs for all those children born in 2000 who are alive thanks to investments in maternal and child health and immunization, they're now 22 and they need jobs. Now, ODA can't do that, but the private sector can. Increasingly, the shareholders of the development banks, which is all of us, are putting pressure on those banks to sweat the balance sheets harder, to get more resource into countries that don't have the sort of fiscal headroom that the rich world has to deal with COVID and other things. So it's incremental. You can't, I think, Rome was not built in a day. I don't think the SDGs are going to be either, and I entirely agree with Michaela. They should be a minimum, not a goal, but for the time being, they are a goal. But I mean, on the positive side, if you listen to what's coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, loss and damage has been central to those discussions. That would not have been the case a few years ago. Small island developing states that are literally sinking because of the effects of climate change have come together and have a far, far louder and more listened to voice than even 5 years ago. So these are incremental changes, but I think there is a growing recognition, I mean, as Michaela said, that if we don't pull together on this, if we don't invest in the global commons, if we don't share what we have more equitably, then humanity is in a pretty bad place at the moment. So again, I would come back to young people. It's their future rather than ours. And the real question for me is, how do you generate this collective political will to not just be sort of to reinforce democracy and build trust? I'm looking at the strap line here, but actually to make sure that democracy delivers for everybody, not the few.
Thank you. There's a lot of material in this, but I would like to make the segue to Thomas, using what you said about COP27, hopeful that loss and damage is being discussed. This is one of the many multilateral processes that are ongoing, which might be one solution. I know, Thomas, from several articles that I read about you, that you are quite optimistic about that. And if I can quote you, 20 or 30 years from now, nations will have realized that they can't tackle today's global challenges without international cooperation. They will have understood that they must reinvest in multilateral institutions and will have mobilized the political will to reform them. Unilateralism and transactionalism will be replaced by a renewed belief in cooperation and multilateralism. Now, how do you think this could happen? Also acknowledging that more and more countries are being classified as autocratic and maybe don't see multilateral collaboration as the first way to go.
Well, let me first say that this was a programmatic statement and not a prognosis that I made when I was at the helm of a regional organization and extremely worried about trends that I saw, trends like rising transactionalism, unilateralism, and less belief in cooperative approaches to solving global problems. And in that sense, I think it's very much about a political recommitment to these kinds of approaches. And I think that will be absolutely decisive if we are optimistic or pessimistic about multilateralism. I think we have seen in combating COVID both phases. In an initial phase, I think we saw very nationalistic, selfish responses, but then in the latter half, I think much more promising multilateral responses, that kind of, again, strengthened my confidence in the system. But I mean, generally speaking, to tell you the truth, I'm not particularly optimistic in a sense. I would differentiate, when I look at the multilateral landscape right now, I think the more homogeneous in composition a multilateral body is these days, the better the chances are that this body, manages to work effectively. And I would, in that sense, be relatively optimistic for like regional organizations like the EU, for defense alliances like NATO, but clearly less optimistic for political bodies, starting with the UN Security Council, but also, the political tools of the organization that I worked for, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The same, I think, the more technical a multilateral institution is orientated, the higher the chances that it will deliver. And so I'm relatively optimistic when it comes to international financial institutions, technical agencies of the UN, but again, less regarding political mechanisms. And perhaps, Susanna talked about resourcing ODA, and I think that would allow me to link it up with my initial statement on to what extent the state of the war will impact the environment in which ODA will operate. I think there will be a huge competition for resources in the months, the years to come. And I mean, defense spending is on the rise. Once the war hopefully ends, there will be costly reconstruction. This will all crowd out resources from more traditional ODA spending. It will crowd out investments from implementing SDGs. And I think it will be very important that ODA manages to make a case that ODA is actually all about prevention, that smart development assistance is a good investment in terms of doing good and reducing the risk of things going bad and triggering crises that will be much more costly later. And I think we will also have to kind of make the case that ODA helps addressing the broader negative repercussions of the war, in particular, the destabilizing effects in the global south in terms of energy and food insecurity, supply chain disruption, etc. So I think these kinds of narratives will be very important if we want to, kind of prevent this crowding out effect in the years to come.
Thank you. I think it's a discussion that we also had in the DAC, including in several of our reports, that we see humanitarian aid actually going up and other resources at the expense of development. Then within development, how do we avoid, and this is a question to all of you, how do we avoid that within the development resources we have available, that democracy, state building is really put at the background? I've already heard a lot about investing in youth, maybe also in civil society. What would be your 3 ingredients to avoid that no resources are going to democracy, because maybe we don't have a fantastic track record on that. So how do we change that narrative? Okay.
I'm very encouraged by
the microphone, sorry.
I'm very encouraged by the agreement at public fora like the COP27, 26, in fact, it started long before then, to agree that damage and loss is something that needs to attract investments to address the damage and the loss. Now, this is not in terms of humanitarian aid. It is about investing in new ways of creating resilient livelihoods for people. And therefore, in my view, resources will never be enough as long as we've got the current model of economic development which is highly financialized. It's an extractive model. It's not a model that invests in the long-term well-being for all. And so I believe that one of the ways we can mitigate the risks of humanitarian aid taking away from investments in the long term is to commit upfront to the need to work differently with different partners. There are many very encouraging examples of self-organizing communities all over the world, including my own country, which is just inviting problems that it didn't have. And so if we can invest in people, which will be in much of Africa, the cities are completely ungovernable because of the desperation in rural areas. People just flock to urban areas. So it's an urban mass, which also builds on the nature of the colonial city, which was an exclusionary city. And so we need to reimagine what urban areas need to look like. There is a program called Africa 1, 2, 3, which is about reimagining new cities in Africa. So we don't replicate cities as we see in Europe or in other parts of the world. Now that's really what it calls for. It calls for a reimagination. But it also calls for high-income countries like France that, and I don't know how many of you know that, France extracted reparations from Haiti for daring to liberate themselves from slavery. And that has left this incredible, painful legacy in Haiti. There needs to be an acknowledgement by France, and that acknowledgement must go with the loss and damage, as we have seen in terms of climate change. And this is not to single them out, but it could be a very inspirational example of how we make good what has been severed in terms of human-to-human relationships. I'm a strong believer that human beings have the capacity to relate in a way that brings out the best in all of us. And so we need to reimagine our institutions to focus on doing just that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas, same question.
Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge that working in authoritarian environments is very challenging. But at the same time, we need to make the case that development cooperation can bolster democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and that disengagement or isolation is not an effective strategy to deal with these countries. And I think we have methods in development cooperation to adapt to different degrees of authoritarianism. Obviously, in a relatively authoritarian setting, you probably not apply budget support because this, would risk strengthening the type of state structures that you wouldn't want to strengthen. You may then, want to focus more on strengthening civil society, its resilience. I think that the point I'm trying to make, you need to adapt the choice of your partners, the choice of your instruments, and then you can even make a difference in very challenging political settings. And clearly, disengagement, isolation, I think that's not going to make a difference. That's not the effective strategy to assume.
Thank you. Suzanne, these are very good points, but if you could, I'm going to add an extra layer of complexity, and sorry about that. So it's really great that we keep doing what Thomas has proposed, but how do we then deal with new providers that are coming on the market, which do not have the same norms and values as we have? Like, how do we compete with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing we do is we don't let people in the global south be the hidden victims of Russian aggression. And that's really important. I mean, this is a personal opinion. Unfortunately, it's not shared by all my members, but I think resources for Ukraine should be additional to ODA. The second thing is we have to powerfully counter Russian narratives that it is the West that is causing food shortages in much of the developing world. It's not. That's not to say there weren't shortages before, caused by climate change and drought, but it is blockading or moving grain far too slowly out of Ukraine and Russia that is making prices go through the roof. And we need to be robust about standing up to this. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that there are many other players, many other donors. We had a really important discussion in the DAC this week about China, that plays an increasingly important role in the global south, usually investing in infrastructure, I have to say, rather than humanitarian or human development. And I think the consensus or the majority view in the committee was that the one thing you don't do is pretend this isn't happening. So we have to find a different, and I think it goes back to what Mabhela said, it's how do we have a different sort of conversation? And there is a willingness to do that. Equally, we have a regular dialogue with Arab donors, and who are very important providers of humanitarian assistance. And I mean, I'll be going to Saudi Arabia in the new year because they've got a summit. They want to talk to us about it. One of the most difficult things for DAC members who do have standards, norms, and yes, they could always be better, but they are transparent, they are accountable to their parliaments, we have a very rigorous peer review process, is when we feel that we're being held to a high set of standards by each other and by partner countries, but some other donors are not. And that's tough, if being results-focused, being country-led, being transparent, being accountable makes for better development partnerships, then everybody should do it. And that my worry there is that some countries may say, well, look, sorry, if this doesn't apply to all, then we won't do it. And history and experience shows that makes for much less effective partnerships. So look, I mean, the geopolitics is becoming more complicated, but it's also offering opportunities. I mean, the triangular cooperation is fantastically important. The two countries in the world that have done more than any other to lift millions, tens of millions of people out of poverty are India and China. They're very different, but I think we have a huge amount to learn from them. Now, one is the world's largest democracy, the other is not. But the fact remains is that they are very, very important players. So as the Development Assistance Committee, it's not just sitting down with people who think the same way as you do. We think of ourselves as a like-minded coalition of the willing. It's actually about sitting down with people who fundamentally disagree with your approach. And I think, if you want to build accountability from the bottom up and to get citizens more involved and to think about community and locality, you have to do that because the world is a very varied place. But my real plea is we've got to focus on the global consequences for poor people of this terrible conflict. And just thinking about the food side of things, I mean, the World Food Programme is saying, this year it is a question of distribution, but very soon it's going to be a question of overall global supply. And that is very, very frightening. And the only way to deal with that is to work together.
Okay. Thank you. We're coming already to the end of this discussion. We could have spoken a lot more. I'll just give the floor to each of you with one key messages that you want decision makers to take tomorrow or in any other forum. What would it be? What would be your one big ask that would be really make a fundamental difference? I've already heard in between the lines from many of you, but make it very concrete, practical. What's the one key message? Pela.
My key message is that treat every human being the way you want to be treated. Then there will be no conflict, no war. And we will make sure that the least amongst us gets the support they need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas?
If we want multilateral institutions to deliver, we need to invest, both political leadership, commitment. This implies resourcing of multilateral institutions, but it also implies political capital. States need to be ready. Basically, multilateralism, multilateral institutions, they need to be cared for, they need to be invested in, and they need to be reformed. And that's very much a function of political commitment. And to share with you an insight that I made when I tried to pull through a reform program in the OECD. I was struck by the huge gap between the lip service of states to reforming a multilateral organization and then their genuine political support in terms of political support and financial support to pull these reforms through.
Thank you. Walk the talk. Susanna.
Yeah, I think mine follows on from both of those. I mean, I would say nurture democracy and treat it with enormous care. And that means everybody needs to invest in better political leadership. And if I may have a second, it's put equality, and particularly gender equality, at the heart of everything you do.
So thank you. I'm not going to try to summarize. I don't think we have a lot of time, but a big thank you to the panelists. That I'm not sure to who I gave. To Julian, and thank you. Thank you.